Come and study the Holy Scriptures with us as Father Stephen DeYoung teaches verse by verse on the podcast, The Whole Counsel of God. Father Stephen holds a Ph.D. in Biblical Studies and is an Orthodox priest serving at Archangel Gabriel Orthodox Church in Lafayette, Louisiana.
Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. When we get started, we'll be picking up in First Epistle of St. Peter, chapter 1, verse 13. So, there's not a lot of recap to do because most of last time we were doing introduction to 1 Peter, 2 Peter, and the Epistle of St. Jude, and we talked about why we were doing those, even though St. Jude's epistle we took kind of out of order, and why we did that. Not going to rehearse all that again. And then we read those first 12 verses, which were basically the introduction to the epistle, where we talked about how in format, 1 Peter is very similar in sort of the overall layout and the epistle style to St. Paul's epistles that we read over the period of a couple of years. So, and that meant that in the introduction, he sort of laid out some of the themes that he's going to be returning to sort of over and over again as we work our way through the epistle. And so what he mainly talked about in the introduction that we read last time was he was talking to, as we said, based on the content of the epistle and the time in St. Peter's life where this would fit to be written, right? And the places that we saw last time it was addressed to, that these were Roman colonies started by Claudius, the same Claudius who we know expelled the Jews from Rome. And St. Peter identifies himself as writing from Rome. And so you put those things together, and it makes sense to believe that he would have written this to some of those sort of exiles. And he's been using kind of diaspora language and that kind of exile language to describe, they're talking about facing hardship. But he's been setting out over against that hardship and suffering, using Christ as an example that beyond that suffering there is hope, right? Beyond Christ's death there was resurrection. Beyond suffering there's hope. And so connecting that then to the second coming of Christ, right? And so we didn't read that much last time, but those are sort of the themes he started working with there in those early verses. And that's really where we're picking up now. We stopped here last time, both for time and because there's a therefore here, right? So having talked about hope beyond suffering, right? Given the examples of the prophets, right, who are waiting for the first coming of Christ, Christ's suffering and his glory, death and resurrection, right? Their suffering and Christ's second coming. Now he's going to shift with that therefore to here's what you need to do now in light of this that we've laid out, sort of in the same way that St. Paul does rhetorically in his epistles. So unless there are any questions or comments or reports from foreign markets, we'll go ahead and pick up in the first epistle of St. Peter, chapter 1, verse 13. Therefore, gird up the loins of your mind, be sober, and rest your hope fully upon the grace that is to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. So this is an interesting turn of phrase, gird up the loins of your mind, right? You might say, I didn't know my mind had loins, right? But girding up your loins is a phrase that occurs several times in the Old Testament and is used obviously it's being used metaphorically here of your mind, but referred to a literal thing, right? Where a person's tunic or robe that was longer would be sort of folded upward. Like if you were going into battle or if you were going to have to run from battle or from something, you would sort of roll that up and tuck it up. You could find, well, I don't think you should Google anything with the word loins in it, but there are sort of diagrams, right, that show how they literally did this, how they would fold it, right? So to give you more freedom of movement, right? So girding up your loins is about preparing yourself, right? Preparing yourself for some kind of battle or struggle or contest or, right, adversity, right? So this is what he's talking about. He's saying, it's like prepping in our current language, right? But he's saying not physically, right, but your mind, right? Your mind. Because the struggle and the battle he's talking about here is a spiritual one, not a physical one, right? He's not saying, get ready for our revolution to overthrow our Roman overlords, right? He's saying, get ready for what lies ahead. And that you do that, right, by being sober, which isn't just not drinking, right? But in general, being serious, being focused, right? Not being distracted, not letting yourself be dulled. And resting your hope fully on the grace that is to be brought to you at the revelation of Christ Jesus, or of Jesus Christ. So notice here, we'll talk about it a little here. And I've said this before, we were talking about St. Paul, but we very much have in our vocabulary, I've even said it a couple of times tonight, we talk about the second coming of Christ. And the language we use sort of conveys this idea that like at Christ's ascension, he went up into the sky, like he went away somewhere. And someday he's going to come back, right, from wherever he is. He's going to come back here. But he's gone right now. Right. And obviously that's not what we actually believe, right? So like every liturgy we say Christ is in our midst. Is there shall be? We say that based on Christ's promise, wherever 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I will be there, right? So he's not off somewhere, right, in the meantime. And so even though that's how we've come to sort of translate it in that misleading way, the words that are actually used in the New Testament, as we've seen. So like we saw St. Paul referring to Christ's glorious appearing, his appearing in glory, right? Appearing, right? Meaning it's not that he's off somewhere. He's here. We just can't see him, right? Tactily, physically, materially right now, right? And we have this language here, right? At the revelation of Jesus Christ, when Jesus Christ is revealed. Right, he's sort of veiled from us right now, where we don't see him, but he will be revealed. And even the Greek word that's most commonly translated as referring to his second coming, the Greek word parousia, doesn't really mean that. You may, if you know a little bit about Greek, the ousia part means being, and then there's para. There's a preposition attached to the front. And parousia, what it really means is sort of presence, right? Being present, right? Well, how did that get translated as second coming? Well, if someone becomes present, right, it can be translated as like arrival, right? So that was kind of how it ended up getting translated into English as the idea of second coming. But that arrival idea, someone becoming present, can also be like appearing or manifesting, right? Like there are other ways to understand that, right? That Christ is going to again become present in a different way than he is now, right? That's what the Greek wording there is really aimed at, right? And so St. Peter's going to talk about this in the same way. He very much does not want to say to people who are suffering, who are struggling, and who are facing difficulties, yeah, Christ is far away, but don't worry, he's coming back, right? That's very much not what he wants to say to them. Not least because it's not true, but also because that's not exactly reassuring and bolstering of your hope, right? But he's here, but the day is coming when his presence here with us is going to be manifest to the whole world, right? And so that's how he talks about it, right? Well, that's what he uses here, the revelation. Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, glorious appearing, St. Paul here, his revelation, other places with parousia, his arrival, appearance, his, right, that idea.
Isn't there an essential element that the unbelievers are going to see him?
Yes, everyone.
So
Everyone.
those people who are giving you trouble now are going to stop giving you trouble.
Yes. Sorry, pre-trib folks. Yes, when Christ returns, everyone's going to see it. Yeah. Yeah. As Christ said in the Gospels, as lightning flashes from the east to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Everyone's going to know. Everyone's going to see. So verse 14, as obedient children, this is continuing the sentence, right? This is all part of girding up our loins and preparing ourselves for the struggles that we're going to face in this life until Christ is manifest again. As obedient children, not conforming yourselves to the former lusts, as in your ignorance, but as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, because it is written, be holy, for I am holy. So this is, as I've said many times before, journal articles have to be published and dissertations have to be written. One of those topics is, what is the makeup of these churches, these communities that St. Peter is writing to? Are they Jewish or are they Gentile? You may have noticed I didn't talk much about that, other than that their connection to Rome is probably from the expulsion of the Jews, right? The reason I didn't talk about that is because there's no way to know. And Exhibit A of that is this verse, right? So, or these two verses, right? So verse 14, if we take that by itself, as obedient children, not conforming yourselves to the former lusts as in your ignorance, that makes it sound like they're Gentiles, right? You were out there, you were ignorant, you didn't know any better, you were following your lusts and desires of the flesh, right? Don't go back to that, right? But then he says, but as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, because it is written, be holy, for I am holy, which is the phrase that's repeated over and over again in the holiness code in Leviticus. So then he quotes the Torah. So if you took that by itself, you'd think, oh, well, these must be Jewish people, right? So there's no real way to isolate that, right? Nor do we need to. We talked about, when we were talking about St. James' epistle, how there's this whole imaginary historical construct of sort of Jewish Christianity led by St. James and Gentile Christianity led by St. Paul, like they're these two different things. And we talked about how that dog don't hunt, really, right? So that doesn't really work out, right? And so, but part of that thinking is we have to try to isolate all this. And so, as we talked about back when we were in the book of Acts and we were talking about St. Paul's missionary journeys and how he would go to the synagogue, and then after he'd gone to the synagogue, he'd go to a wider audience. Most of St. Paul's early Gentile converts did not convert directly from paganism to Christianity. Right? This is one of the big things that complicates that whole idea of there being Jewish Christianity and Gentile Christianity. Most of them did not come straight from paganism. Most of them were from this group that are referred to usually in the New Testament, in Acts and elsewhere, as God-fearers. So there were people who were non-Jews, right? And again, we're not talking about modern ethnicity, meaning you became a Jew by being circumcised if you were male, being the wife or daughter of a circumcised male if you're a woman, and by eating the Passover, right? That's the bare minimum. That makes you a Jew. So there were people who were not Jews. They had not been circumcised or were not married to or the daughter of a person, and they weren't eating the Passover, but who were sort of fascinated by Judaism. In fact, there was kind of a Judaism fad in the 1st century BC and 1st century AD among Romans. Not where they were going to go convert, right? There were no Roman men and Greek men lining up to get circumcised, right? But They were fascinated by it for a bunch of reasons. One reason was that Pompey, when he annexed Jerusalem, famously barged into the Holy of Holies and found it empty. And so he found it bizarre that there was no idol, right? There's no image of the God there and everything. And so he said, the Jews must worship their God sola mentis, right? Only with their minds. And so that sort of fascinated, philosophically minded, right? Like Romans, like, wow, oh, this is some kind of refined religion, right? This is some kind of, so they're kind of fascinated with it. The Hebrew scriptures have been translated into Greek by this time and were in wide circulation in Greek. In most of the world, at synagogues, they were being read in Greek and only in Greek. So Gentiles, especially Gentiles of means, had access to them. They could study them and learn about what they saw as this ancient and exotic religious tradition from the East, right? And we know that many of those people became benefactors of synagogues throughout the Roman world because we have like the dedication stones from these ancient Roman synagogues. And they have a bunch of names on them that are not Jewish names, right? They are Latin and Greek names and definitely pagan names, right? Who are being thanked for giving and endowing, right? And this was a common part of Greek ethics going back to Aristotle, was that one of the virtues was being generous, especially toward the gods. So wealthy benefactors, this display of their piety, which was seen as a moral virtue, was endowing temples all over the place, right? To all different gods, right? Cover all your bases, right? Make everybody like you, right? And that would include synagogues, right? Because they wouldn't take their money at the temple in Jerusalem, right? But synagogues, right? That's how they kept going, right? And so part of the dynamic that's playing out in the book of Acts was that, and the reason he faced so much resistance from the synagogues in these cities is he was coming to these God-fearers, right, who kind of knew the Jewish scriptures. Some of them would attend synagogue, right, because they were kind of fascinated by it, and who were endowing and supporting these synagogues and say, hey, you could come and worship the God of Israel. You could become a Christian, and you don't have to get circumcised, and you don't have to worry about this other stuff, right? And so they would then become part of the Christian movement and maybe stop endowing the local synagogue, right? So there was a very material conflict going on in a lot of these cities, right? Over this middle group that weren't pagans, nor were they Jewish, right? This group in the middle were being sort of fought over, right? But most of St. Paul's Gentile converts were from that group. And so what that means is you can't make this clear-cut distinction between a Gentile Christian and a Jewish Christian. It's more messy than that, right? And we've also talked about how diverse Judaism was at the time. So an Ethiopian Jew or a Jew in Alexandria or a Jew in Judea or Galilee, a Jew in Athens, a Jew in Rome, were not just culturally different, but they were reading different Jewish texts. They had very different views on different things. There were all these different Jewish sects. So even if you're just talking about quote-unquote Jewish Christianity, that's not like a monolithic thing either. So there's a lot of diversity here in different people and groups, right? And so almost all of these communities, I mean, the community in Jerusalem was obviously very much Jewish. You go to a place like Athens, and it's very clear in Acts that most of Paul's converts, based on their names, were pagans, right? We talked about in Corinth, most of them were pagans. But that's depending on the city and the size of the Jewish community there, and right, so, and the makeup. But they're all this mixed makeup of different people from different backgrounds and different former beliefs. And so St. Peter is writing to all of them, right? And it's kind of a mistake to do what's called mirror reading and try to figure out, based on what he says, who the audience is, right? And not only is it sort of problematic in terms of trying to determine it, but you end up creating this kind of weird interpretive circle where you're like, okay, based on this, he's talking to this group. And since he's talking to this group, he must mean this. Now you've created this circle, right? That's based on nothing, right? It's just this sort of recursive interpretive loop. Yes?
But don't you think also that his references to Old Testament, to Scripture,
Right.
would not, it would include Gentiles?
It would
in the sense that that continuity of faith and a, kind of breaking open of revelation, it doesn't seem that the Old Testament would be only for the Jews.
right,
Is it?
right. That's part of what I'm aiming at.
Okay.
Right. So he could quote, the fact that he's quoting Leviticus doesn't mean he's only talking to Jews.
Right. 'Cause
Right.
It doesn't give,
Yeah.
the word for, it just seems that it's more of a reference and context.
Yeah. And likewise, he can say to someone who was previously in the Jewish synagogue, don't go back to your former lusts. Right? Because it's not like every Jewish person in the world was totally perfect in terms of the Torah before they joined the Christian movement, right? So that's so that's a supporting point, right? That it's not that neat, right? It's not that, Okay. But so the fact that he's quoting this part of Leviticus, though, is also important. Because this is going to be I'm going to be picking on a different group of people in this book. Instead of sorry Calvinists, it's going to be sorry dispensationalists. The holiness code in Leviticus is usually it's marked off as Leviticus chapter 17 through 23. And this "be holy for I am holy" is a refrain through it. And that phrase that St. Peter quotes is why it's called the holiness code, right? As a literary unit. And this includes a lot of the laws. This includes like the food laws. This is mostly directed at Israel and specifically at Israel. And when I say specifically at Israel, I mean Israel was never called to go and enforce these parts of their law on the neighboring nations, right? They didn't say, you need to go conquer Moab and don't let them eat pork anymore, right? There was nothing like that, right? These aren't things that they were to enforce other people. And in the Holiness Code, as we talked about, when we talked about Acts 15 way back in the long ago time, there were only 4 commandments, the 4 commandments that end up in Acts 15, that were even applied to Gentiles living in Israel, right? So most of the Holiness Code, most of this body of text that St. Peter is citing here, applied only to the nation of Israel, only to people who were circumcised, ate the Passover, did all these things, right? They were bound to these laws. And St. Peter is now applying these texts to Christian churches, Christian communities, right? Meaning he thinks that the latter is a continuation of the former, not a different thing than the former, right? That these Christian communities are a continuation of, right, the synagogues in those places. Not that, well, that's over and now we've got this new thing, right, that's different and has a different set of rules. And none of that Torah stuff, none of that law stuff applies to it anymore. Remember, we talked about this is one of the ways that people try to set St. Peter and St. James against St. Paul. Oh, well, St. Paul was against all that Torah stuff. St. James liked all that Torah stuff, right? As we saw, that doesn't work, right? Because St. Paul says all kinds of good things about the Torah. And so does St. James, right? But St. James is also not some kind of weird legalist, right? As we saw, right? Any more than St. Paul is. So he's applying it here, right? And this is, Notice he says, be holy in all your conduct. That your is added. In all conduct, right? But he's directing it to you. It's an imperative. Okay? And so this, again, is pointing to the Torah. Why? Because he's not just saying, hey, don't break the 10 Commandments. Right? This is a higher thing than that. This is in all your ways. Right? And we talked about how Torah means teaching. Right? And it's a lot, I won't go through it all now, but we talked about how there's this weird linguistic translation process where we end up receiving it as law, but that kind of distorts what it is. The idea of teaching, and in Greek nomos, right, includes the idea of culture, morality, ethics, even politics, when you talk about the ethics within a community, right, the ancient conception of politics, right? All that's included in that idea. So when St. Peter says, in all your conduct be holy, right? This isn't just a matter of not violating some rules, right? This is a positive command, and this embraces all aspects of life, sort of the way the Torah does, right? Verse 17, and if you call on the Father, who without partiality judges according to each one's work, conduct yourselves throughout the time of your stay here in fear. Okay. Calling on the Father, right? Remember the Old Testament, the phrase calling on the name of the Lord, right, was used for worship, right? Someone would build an altar and would say, he built an altar and there he called upon the name of the Lord. Right? That doesn't mean he was just yelling God's name, right? That means he was worshiping. He was offering sacrifices. He was offering worship, right? So he's saying, if you truly worship the Father, right? If you truly worship God the Father, the one who judges without partiality each person according to their work, right? If you worship him and you know that he's going to judge you according to your works, right, then you should be conducting yourself throughout the time of your stay here, throughout this life, right, in fear. And that's not fear like being terrified of God, right? That's fear as in awe and reverence, right? Meaning you have in mind, right, the day is going to come when I'm going to stand before God and have to give an account, right? And so if I really believe in him, if I really am worshiping, seeking to follow God, then the way I will show that is by conducting myself in a way that reflects the fact that I'm going to stand in front of him, right, one day and give an account for this.
So not solo feeding.
Well, I'm trying to restrict who I bash to just one group at a time in a given night. But yes, it does say he's going to judge us according to our works. Verse 18, knowing that you are not redeemed with corruptible things like silver or gold from your aimless conduct received by tradition from your fathers. Well, we'll pause there. But I'll make this short. So we weren't redeemed with corruptible things like silver and gold. Notice he says corruptible things, and then it says like silver and gold. So in the minds of ancient people, silver and gold were not corruptible things. Corruptible things were things that you would buy with silver and gold, right? And so if you wanted to hold on to your wealth, right, you didn't go and buy clothes and food and things that rot and rust and go away. You'd get silver and gold because you could lay it up, right, forever. Nothing's going to happen to it, right? So when he says with corruptible things like silver and gold, right, St. Peter is making the point that even those things that you think are the most reliable and the most trustworthy, when you take into account the shortness of our life, right, our stay here, they're ultimately just as corruptible, right, in the end result, right? That's not what we were redeemed with, right? Because, of course, redeemed here is the idea of redemption is buying back, right? So God didn't redeem us from slavery to sin with money, right? He didn't just go buy us out of slavery with money. And that's from your aimless conduct. Slavery for sin is the aimless conduct received by tradition from your fathers. So just briefly again, there are people who will look at this and say, oh, well, this must be Gentiles, right? Because St. Peter wouldn't call the Torah aimless conduct received by tradition from your fathers, right? But he could also be referring to the fact that if they're Jewish, their fathers in the Old Testament didn't keep the Torah. And he could be saying, you're just like, see what I mean about it being kind of a waste of time trying to figure out who's who in the audience? Right? But so the point is, because of that conduct, right? Because of that conduct, we were made slaves, right, to sin, right? And this isn't just something we came up with, like this for generations. We've been enslaved to sin, right? And now God has redeemed us from that, right? And he didn't redeem us from that with any material things, right? Verse 19, but with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish and without spot. Okay. So it was the blood of Christ that rescued us, which is far more precious, obviously, than even gold and silver, which in the end result are just material things. It's as of a lamb without blemish and without spot. Why is that important? Well, where does a lamb without blemish and without spot show up in the Old Testament? Passover. Passover. And what happens with the blood of the Passover lamb? We jump too quickly because we've gotten this Western view of atonement in our head. We think, oh, the blood of Christ. So Christ was killed. That's what did it, right? Well, you can go look at the Passover ritual, right? It's not ritualized how you kill the lamb. You have to kill it because you're going to cook it and eat it, right? So you're not going to eat it alive, right? So, and you have to get the blood out, right? So because you're going to do something else with the blood and then you're going to eat it, right? And there's not even an element of substitution. It's been a while since we talked about this, so I'll briefly go over it again with that lamb, right? So if there was an element of substitution, and some people, again, who have that Western idea of atonement in their head, will present the Passover this way. They'll say, okay, God's killing all the firstborn in Egypt. For some reason, he wants to also kill all the firstborn Israelites. Now, I don't know why that would be, first of all, right? Because the reason he was killing the firstborn of the Egyptians was that the Egyptians murdered the Israelite babies, right? So this is about balancing the scales of justice. They murdered the Israelite children who God identified as his children. So they murdered God's children, right? And so God is now going to take their firstborn children is the idea. So I don't know why he would want to kill more Israelite children. That alone doesn't make sense. But it's posited that he did. But he would accept, or he would be sated, I guess, right? His desire to kill a child would be sated if someone killed a lamb instead, provided it was a pure lamb without spot or blemish. So here's the problem with that substitution idea, that they're killing the lamb instead of the kid, right? So when the Israelites are told to do this, what about families that don't have any sons? Do they just not have to do it? Well, no, they're still supposed to do it, right? What about a family where both the father and his son are firstborn sons? Did they do 2 lambs? No, they just do 1. And in fact, if you read Exodus closely, if you have a really small family and there's another small family next door and you're not going to be able to eat a whole lamb by yourself, you can share one with your neighbor. So is it that in that case, God will take 1 lamb for 2 babies? Right? It doesn't make sense, right? It doesn't map out, right? But if you read the text in Exodus, I believe it's Exodus 13, if I'm remembering correctly. If you read that, God says what he's doing, and it's not that. He says, tonight I will make a distinction between the Israelites and the Egyptians. That's the purpose of the Passover ritual, to make a distinction between the Israelites and the Egyptians. Because the previous plagues, many of them at least, fell on the areas of Egypt other than the place where most of the Israelites lived. But if you were an Egyptian living in that neighborhood, you lucked out because they didn't fall on you, right? So it was just based on the rough area where people were living. Okay, but on that night, God says, I'm making a distinction. So the part of the ritual that involves the blood that St. Peter is referring to here was that blood was put on the doorpost. Remember? And when the blood was put on the doorpost, angel of death passed by. Right? Angel of death passed by. So, on that night, everyone who marked their doorpost with the blood of a lamb like that was an Israelite from that day forward. It didn't matter ethnically where they were from. Right? We know later on some of them were black Africans, some of them were Egyptians. I mean, it says so in the text. Some of them were Canaanites, right? But they were all Israelites if they did that. And anyone who didn't do that on that night in Egypt, didn't matter if they were directly descended from Abraham and could trace their lineage back. If they did not mark the door, they were now an Egyptian. Right? So this was the purpose, right? Was to make this distinction and to mark these people out. So this is what St. Peter is comparing our redemption to, right? And redemption's the appropriate word because Passover is about manumission. And I use that word just because I want to teach everyone the word manumission, which means to purchase out of slavery. So that's what happens, right? A bunch of people who are slaves in Egypt, right, through the Passover are set free. Right? And so this is the comparison St. Peter is making. Right? So we were enslaved to sin. And the wages of sin is death, as St. Paul told us. So that's where we were headed. We were headed for death. Right? But Christ offered himself, and we've been now marked out with the blood of Christ. And so we escape death and are freed from slavery to sin. Right? That's what St. Peter's getting at. Right? But it was the blood of Christ that did that. It was Christ who did that for us. Right? And that's far more precious than gold and silver and all the other things this world has to offer. Because what's the point St. Peter's been making here? How did this, again, context. First verse we read. Put all your hope on the grace of Christ at his appearing. Which means put none of your hope where? Gold, silver, the things of this world. Right? Why? Because those aren't the things that saved you from death. They're not going to save you from death. It's Christ who saved us from sin and death. Right? Verse 20, he indeed was foreordained before the foundation of the world, but was manifest in these last times for you. Okay. So notice the language there. We pointed this out a lot in St. Paul. Right? St. Peter is pretty clear that Christ pre-existed his birth as a man. Right? Because he was foreordained for the foundation of the world. And he refers to him being born from the Theotokos as him being manifest on earth. Right? What is he comparing that to? The revelation of Christ at the end, when he'll be manifest again. Right? Verse 21, who through him, that being the you who through him, I'll retranslate it, are faithful to God, who raised him from the dead and gave him glory, so that your faith and hope are in God. Right? God the Father raised him from the dead and gave him glory, right? And therefore your faithfulness in this life and your hope in the next life are in God. Why? That God will do the same for you, will raise you from the dead and bring you into his glory, as he did for Christ. Verse 22, since you have purified your souls in obeying the truth through the Spirit, in sincere love of the brethren, love one another fervently with a pure heart. Okay? So we're still after the therefore. So the one thing is this preparation, focusing on Christ, right? And then secondly, right, that was sort of directed toward God, right? Our faithfulness toward God, our hope in God. Now it's talking about other people, the other people in the Christian community, right? And he talked about being holy. So if we've purified our souls and obeying the truth, right? If we've purified our souls before God, then now we also love one another and live in love with each other with a pure heart. Verse 23, having been born again, not of corruptible seed, but incorruptible, through the word of God, which lives and abides forever. Okay? The word of God should be capitalized there, because obviously he's not talking about the Bible. Bible didn't exist. Right? He's not saying they were born again through the Bible. Right? He's saying through Christ. Right? Who lives and abides forever, as he just said, from the foundation of the world. Right? And so this is another way of coming at, right? He talked about being set free from slavery to sin, right? Being preserved from death. And now he's talking about being born again, right? Not literally. Again, he's contrasting that same contrast. The things of this world are corruptible, right? All of our human fathers were imperfect men, right? Even the nicest and the greatest human fathers are not perfect, right? And some are very, very not perfect, right? But they're all corruptible, and to some extent corrupted, and struggling with sin, right? But God our Father, right, is incorruptible, right, and is not. And so now we've been born again as his children. Right? And so this is a life where we can love one another with a pure heart, as opposed to the sort of corrupted forms of love and lusts and whatever else we lived in before, as he said. Verse 24, because all flesh is as grass, and all the glory of man is the flower of the grass withers and its flower falls away, but the word of the Lord endures forever. That's from Isaiah chapter 40. So this makes it pretty clear, right? He draws on this analogy from the prophet Isaiah, right? All flesh, our lives in this world is like the grass. It's here today, it's dried up and gone tomorrow, right? It withers, flowers fall away, right? But the word of the Lord, capital W, again, Christ, right, endures forever. Now this is the word, capital W, which by the gospel was preached to you. The gospel preached Christ to them. It didn't preach the Bible to them. Right?
Listen next time as Father Stephen DeYoung continues his study of the Scriptures on the whole counsel of God. Father Stephen's email address is wholecounsel@ancientfaith.com. That's wholecounsel@ancientfaith.com.